Horror games. I love them. From the subtle, creeping dread of a game like Silent Hill to the loud, bombastic threats of Five Nights at Freddy's, I love them all in every way. The reason horror is so fascinating to me is because there are just so many ways to make horror. From quick spooks to psychological torture, themes of deserved punishment or unfortunate circumstances, killers in mascot suits to cosmic gods, all of these can be perfectly crafted to make our monkey brains go ook ook, this ain't good. And during my indulging in all of these delectable flavors of I ended up asking myself a very interesting question. Do horror games have to be scary? On the outset, that sounds ridiculous. I mean, you may as well ask, does comedy have to be funny? Though Adam Sandler has made a career out of proving that one, I guess. But this 7-word clickbait is so complex and esoteric that I feel like I need to actually explain the question itself before we dive into the meat of things. In other words, what the hell do I mean by do horror games have to be scary? And I don't mean do horror games have to be scary to me, because then I could just point to the vast majority of Bendy and the Ink Machine and call it a day. So let me break it down for you. First, what exactly do I mean by horror game, since there are plenty of games that have some kind of spooky moments in them. So yeah, that piano from Mario 64 may have scared you as a kid. For me, it was Bubba in Tiny Huge Island, but I wouldn't try arguing that Mario 64 is a horror game unless I was desperate for some good clickbait. No, we're only going to be looking at games whose primary motive is to instill some kind of horror. So while I've certainly found moments of Subnautica to be far scarier than anything in Layers of Fear, Subnautica is first and foremost a survival crafting game, whereas Layers of Fear's main goal, regardless of result, is to scare me. So for the next part of the question, what do I mean by have to be scary? Unfortunately, that is a question that can't be contained solely in this intro, because boy, howdy is that a quagmire of a quandary. But this ain't my first rodeo, and I'm armed with studies on psychology, biology, sociology, and pathophysiology. That last one because I'm helping my sister study for an ostomy exam. Yes, it's pretty gross. So the first part of this video will focus on defining the initial question, whereas the second part will actually be answering that question. And for that, I'll be using a game that to this day still comes back to haunt me, and not in the good way. I literally cannot escape it for some reason. So get cozy, grab a snack, and look at my cat. We're diving into the question. Picking up where I left off, we still need to clarify what... I've lost it. Something precious. My... sleep schedule. Yep, it's a Manta Sleep ad, but not for the mask, for something new. Bam! The Manta Sleep White Noise Machine. Let me tell you why I love it. First, unlike other heretical white noise machines, the Manta Sleep White Noise Machine doesn't require its own app or even your phone. Like at all. Instead, the Manta Sleep White Noise Machine comes with its own dedicated remote that can work up to 32 feet away, and its tactile buttons are made to be easily used in the dark. You can literally just pull it out of the box, plug it in, and it's ready to go with 15 different soundscapes. Do you have any idea how refreshing that is? Also, unlike those other stupid, dumb, pale impressions of the majesty of the Manta Sleep Noise Machine, this white noise will gently fade out as the adjustable timer expires, so you aren't jolted awake by a sudden stop in sound. Additionally, these noises have 0 gaps, and it's created to gently shield outside noise. By placing it near the source, such as a door or window, it helps to mask or muffle that disruptive noise. And its sound quality is so crisp and clean, it's just like biting into a crisp, juicy apple. So use promotional code CheeseYeen to get 10% off your next order, or follow the link in the description. And now, back to the video. Picking up where I left off, we still need to clarify what I mean by scary. There are plenty of things in life that are scary in an existential sense, like credit card debt or getting a message from your boss telling you to come to my office, but neither of those things are typically the direct main focus of a horror game. That being said, existential threats like that absolutely can be used as a tool for good horror. For example, a big part of the horror in Squid Games is how these people are so burdened by debt that they're willing to risk their lives for a shot at financial freedom. So to better define what I mean by scary, let's start with a proper thesis. Scary is not the same thing as horror. I mean, it kind of can't be, because otherwise I would be asking the question, do horror games have to be horror games? And that's some Zen enlightenment shit that I'm not prepared nor qualified to answer. But creating this thesis is useful because it requires that I define both scary and horror, giving a more concrete foundation to what is otherwise a rather conceptual topic. So to start, let's go ahead and define scary. Issue is, the term scary can be applied to both situations like preparing to go in for intensive surgery and being attacked by a coked up gorilla. While you would be right to to call either situation scary, and most people would agree with you, I'm going to be that guy and argue that the surgery example is actually stressful and the cokehead gorilla is truly scary. But this isn't me arguing semantics like the guy who goes, "Oh, surely you meant this belongs to whom, not this belongs to who." No, I am defining scary as different from stressful because I'm talking about what literally makes us scared, as in neurobiology. Yes, I am digging this deep, grab a shovel or get out. In the brain, the amygdala is what triggers the human fear response. In fact, it's what controls most, if not all, fear responses, including being startled and stressed. However, the amygdala does have different responses for different types of fear. To start, let's talk about phasic fear. This is the apprehension of an immediate and present threat. For example, if I use my magic powers I learned in Louisiana to suddenly teleport you in front of a hungry gator, you would probably become very scared. That response is the result of your brain reverting to monkey mode and your amygdala sending outputs directly to the hypothalamus, which would then tell your body to respond to the threat with This type of fear, while extremely intense, quickly fades either due to removal of the stimuli or acclimatization, which is the process of getting used to a threat after being exposed to it for too long. Anxiety, meanwhile, is a type of fear response to threats that are more distant but still present. So to contrast, now I teleport you to the middle of a murky swamp in the dead of night, and I tell you there's a gator somewhere nearby that I've been raising to love the taste of man meat. This would trigger your brain to produce corticotropin-releasing factor, which is a type of stress hormone. What's interesting about this stress hormone that I don't want to pronounce anymore is that it's able to increase human attention and alertness without the use of adrenaline, though some adrenaline production during stress is common. But this factor creates that feeling of hyper-alertness, despite the fact that you're not entirely sure where the threat is, or even if it's nearby in the first place. By contrast, the immediate fear response, or phasic fear response, does trigger the amygdala to produce a lot of adrenaline very quickly, creating that immediate, "Ha!" response, along with panic and other fear responses. In fact, it's theorized that this production of adrenaline during the phasic fear response is part of the reason why humans enjoy being scared in the first place. But what does any of this really cool biology have to do with our thesis? Well, let's trudge back onto the swamp. The example where I teleport you directly in front of a hungry gator is definitely scary and would elicit the fear response, but I wouldn't call it horror. Rather, it's the second scenario where you're in my mystical murder swamp and you know that there's a gator somewhere, you know it's hungry, you know it's coming for you, but you don't know where from or when or how big that gator is. That is closer to horror and elicits more of the stress response. Thus, let's go back to our thesis again, scary is not the same as horror, and reword it to better fit this biological definition. Fear is not the same as stress. This statement, as I just showed, is literally true on a biological level. Phasic fear releases different factors to produce a more immediate response, whereas stress and anxiety produce different longer-term responses that increase general awareness of a potentially dangerous situation. However, I can't just slap these two theses next to each other and claim victory. I have to prove the equivalence of these statements. In other words, if I'm claiming that scary is not the same as horror is true because fear is not the same as stress is true, I must also prove the fear response is what I mean by scary. And yes, that's exactly what I mean. I could legit replace the title of this video with "Do horror games have to trigger the phasic fear response?" Except I won't because the algorithm would just straight up kill me for that. But hold on, that doesn't make this video as clear-cut as you might think, because the phasic fear response is triggered by far more than just some monster screaming in your face. What's so interesting about feeling scared is that there are plenty of non-horror ways to invoke that feeling. For example, a game can become emotionally scary when someone else is in visible danger, granted you actually care about them and aren't actively cheering for their death.
Trust me.
In a similar vein, a game can also be scary when a character you care about actually dies. This is called acute grief, the moment when you learn about or witness the death of someone you care about, and it does in fact trigger the fear response. This acute grief can also be applied to objects we consider valuable. For all my fellow survival game enthusiasts, I know we've all felt the sudden fear of hiking back to base with a backpack filled with valuable items and then, oh shit, that's a cliff, fuck! These all count as different types of phasic fear responses. So yes, for this video, I am stating that scary is the same as something that elicits the phasic fear response. I know that may seem a bit specific, but I kind of have to be specific for this video, because if I define scary as everything that makes you go, then you could make the legitimate claim that the stealth sections in Octodad are scary. So with the first half of our statement that scary is not the same thing as horror clarified by stating that phasic fear is what I mean by scary, we have to talk about the second part of this thesis, specifically how I now have to equate horror with stress. So am I claiming right now that horror is the same as stress? Well, to quote Fat Chance from Venture Bros,
sometimes.
to dip my toes back into the waters of biology for a second, technically, some research defines stress as any kind of fear stimuli. Thus, a Freddy Faz scare would be considered stress by this definition. However, for the purposes of this video, when I talk about stress, I'm specifically referring to stress in terms of anxiety. So is this kind of stress the same as horror? Well, this is where things get a bit more messy because it depends on context. For example, when I play Satisfactory, I require absolutely every part of my factory to be working at 100% efficiency. And if something is clogging up my production line, I am indeed very stressed until that error is resolved and everything is working at 100% accuracy again. Really not beating the accusations this time. And while that is stressful, I wouldn't call watching a percentage slowly ticking down horror. At least, not in this context, as there's a rather famous game you better bet I'm gonna be using to bait the algorithm, Five Nights at Hololive. In this game, watching a percentage tick down induces stress just like it does for me in Satisfactory. However, in this case, the countdown to getting jump scared by the dog girl meter invokes actual horror. Okay, let me actually switch to Five Nights at Freddy's because I kinda need to talk about this in earnest. So why does a falling percent meter in FNAF evoke horror, but not in Satisfactory? Context. What do each of these decreasing numbers mean? Well, in Satisfactory, a machine not working at 100% efficiency, especially in a factory designed to work at 100% like mine, this could lead to jams further down the line of production, which could compound across various supply lines and result in inconsistent power usage and certain products not being produced at all. And while that's certainly annoying, it's not scary. Nothing about this will create that immediate fear response, and that's where the power meter in Five Nights at Freddy's differs. The power meter falling is stressful because reaching zero will lead to immediate danger, but more specifically, it will lead to a fear response, and that is the difference. For example, Shuta's Blood and Teeth also has a number that ticks down, and it reaching zero results in a consequence. That number is also known as a health bar, a strange and obscure mechanic you may have heard about before. While dying is definitely something you want to avoid and will create a level of frustration, in Shuta's Blood and Teeth, death is only about as frustrating as dying in pretty much any other game. You lose some progress and have to try again. So how does death here, or in fact in any other non-horror game with a health bar, differ from death in a horror game? Well, here comes the twist, because it does not. The act of dying is not the scary part of a horror game. Once the monster kills you, that's it. All tension is gone because you've lost and now have to try again. I mean, just think to the childhood trauma that is Bowser's Big Blast. The most stressful part of that game is just after you've chosen a switch and you're waiting for the result. Once the Bowser Bomb reveals your fate, the tension is gone and replaced by either relief or frustration. That's because it's the build-up to dying that's actually the scary part, not the dying itself. I mean, hell, this will be the third time I've quoted Alfred Hitchcock on this channel, but I cannot think of a more apt time to say it. There is no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it. So to bring this all the way back to the topic of stress, there is a clear difference in the stress created by fast-paced action than there is in slowly building horror. And that difference is vast. I've said before that there is no essence of horror, no one thing that makes a situation scary. The scale of the threat, story context, monster buildup, resource expenditure, limited options, and so many more factors can all contribute to making a stressful scenario a horror scenario. And that's what's so fun about horror stress. It's not limited to just being chased by some sexy monster. Just the correct environment can create horror stress, and I can think of no better example than PT. You were taken from us too soon. The disturbing imagery, uncertainty as to your character's past, the anticipation of what will change on the next loop, and the unpredictable nature of these changes all make for an incredibly stressful experience. So no, looking at the example of health bars, not all stress is horror, but is all horror stress? Yes. Now, that's a pretty sweeping claim, and I can already see a few objections. For one, stress isn't fun. Most people typically go out of their way to reduce or eliminate stress from their lives, so if horror is a type of stress, why do so many humans seek it out? Well, because in the scope of the animal kingdom, humans are kinky freaks. First of all, unlike real-world stress, horror games or movies exist within a psychological concept known as protective frames. A simple example of this is roller coasters versus car crashes. In both scenarios, our bodies are exposed to heavy, constantly changing abrupt G-forces out of our control. The difference is that a car crash has no control whatsoever and introduces actual danger, whereas a roller coaster is a meticulously designed experience engineered to be as safe as possible. In other words, the quote-unquote danger of a roller coaster is contained. In a similar manner, the danger and stress of a horror game is also contained. The threats all exist within a fictional scope that can't actually harm us or have an adverse effect on our lives, unless you're playing Corsikovia, in which I guess you might actually go deaf from the experience. And additionally, they're video games, meaning we have the option to just get up and walk away if the experience becomes too intense. In fact, protective frames in general allow us to engage in the human phenomenon known as sensation seeking. Often misconstrued, this idea doesn't mean that humans seek out all sensations, both positive and negative, nor is this the same as thrill seeking. Rather, it means that humans tend to seek novel sensations in general. This can manifest in a desire for travel, trying new foods, or even picking up a new hobby. And risky or stressful situations, once again placed within a protective frame, are one example of this. Additionally, recent studies have suggested the existence of coactivation, which is the human ability to feel directly conflicting emotions at the same time, such as simultaneously experiencing both stress and excitement. An example of this can be seen during my Poppy Playtime playthrough.
3, 2...
That was for me, I'm sorry. That was for me. Wait a minute, I don't have a Poppy Playtime video. Maybe because it's going to be part of an upcoming new channel where you can watch me play horror games every week. Then there's also the idea of a reward for engaging and then succeeding in a stressful situation. Boss fights are an easy example. The stress of dodging, taking damage, moving into strike, and then the climactic moment when you get that final hit. Part of the rush of victory isn't just the sense of accomplishment, but the relief in being removed from the stress of that fight. And this can be translated to horror by the relief of escaping a monster's territory. I mean, hell, just look at my reaction from Secret of the Mimic when I managed to escape from Professor Genki. That was actually good. That was actually good. In terms of media consumption, it's not just horror is stress, it's horror is a subset of stress contained within a protective frame. Yeah, move over, Hitchcock. Now, we could try to further refine this statement by defining the specific subsets of stress that create horror, but again, there are so many beautiful and tantalizing ways to invoke that feeling of terror that listing them all could literally be its own script, and I still have yet to even touch the actual topic of this video. Oh yeah. So to delay just a bit longer, let's finalize everything we just finished talking about. On a biological level, we know that fear is not the same thing as stress, and since we are defining fear as scary and stress as horror, we can say that scary is not the same as horror. I mean, I'm pretty sure I proved that pretty well with my whole surprise alligator example and didn't actually need to dive into the neurobiology of it all, but I like talking about theory, fight me. So with our finalized statement in tow, let's create a new hypothesis, specifically one that actually answers the subject of this video. Horror games require scary elements to be considered horror games, with the null hypothesis of horror games do not require scary elements to be considered horror games. No, I'm not trying to justify my analytics degree. That's what the Freddy Fazbear tax evasion video is for. And yes, that is a video I'm working on. Take a look at this Excel spreadsheet and get excited. Again, however, this isn't an easy question to answer because the simple fact of the matter is that not everyone finds the same things scary or horrifying. For example, while I don't consider it a horror game, there were moments in Subnautica that legitimately scared the piss out of me. Don't ask me about my introduction to the crab squid. I'll cry. Meanwhile, a close friend of mine played that game and didn't find it scary at all. And in terms of horror games, to this day, I'll still get the rare comment telling me that Bendy and the Ink Machine was terrifying to them, despite the fact that I was bored throughout the entire experience. Except for the projectionist. Still mad he wasn't in the sequel. Like, what the fuck? This is why the question can't be as simple as, does a horror game have to be scary? Because that is entirely subjective. And again, I am trying to be scientific here. The question isn't, is the game scary? It's, is it making an attempt to be scary? Because for every snob like me, someone is discovering horror through a game like Indigo Park, and whether that leads them down the path of mascot horror or more traditional scares, they'll find Lloydford L. Lion just as scary as I found the zombies from House of the Dead 3 as a kid. Not that I think House of the Dead is a horror game.
I found it, Daniel. These genes will change the future.
Jury's still out on that one. So if a horror game is even attempting to make us feel that rush of panic and surge of adrenaline associated with the sudden stimuli, that counts as a game being scary. And this can extend to games without traditional enemies. Still Wakes the Deep has plenty of moments where it's the rig itself that's causing a panic as it's falling apart around you. Or hell, you can trigger that stress response even without a threat of death. Layers of Fear almost never has moments that can kill the player, but it does put you in situations to trigger that sudden fear response. So again, the horror games part of this question is going to cover any game that is earnestly trying to be a horror game, regardless of the end result. And now that we finally have our question defined, specified, lubed, and loaded, how do we prove or disprove our hypothesis? Well, since this isn't a question that lends itself to regression analysis, what we need to do is find an example. A game that never puts you in danger, a game with no jump scares, a game that even if it did have intense moments, they're either entirely skippable or so easy to remove that it wouldn't change the game at all. A game that relies heavily on storytelling and character moments to get an honest reaction out of, oh god damn it, it's the fucking park again!
ダメだねダメよダメなのよ
You know, at the end of that game, Lorraine said,
In my heart and mind, I always return to Atlantic Island Park.
which I thought was just a lazy attempt at metaphor and not a goddamn Pharaoh's curse, because the park has haunted almost every one of my videos at this point. For those of you who haven't played it, or, let's be honest, watched a playthrough on YouTube, you can check one out right here! But for a brief synopsis that required I go back and play this stupid, boring game again because I lost all my original footage, you play as Lorraine, a single mother with a tragic past who wanders around the world's most boring theme park ever since Marineland closed. Boy, is that a deep cut. While pretending to look for her lost son named
Callum! 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 Callum!
The game itself is nothing but a walking sim, and I mean that entirely literally. It is nothing but a walking sim. There are no puzzles, no obstacles, no enemies. You just walk from ride to ride and listen to Lorraine constantly complaining about her shitty life.
People come into your life for a reason. Dad used to say that before Mom ran off. After that, he mostly just drank.
The only part I even remotely liked was in the witch's house, where the game stopped talking about Lorraine's trauma and actually showed it to us, which it should have been doing this whole time, then leading us to the game's climax, where Callum goes from spoiled brat to spoiling in a ditch. Now, while this game didn't scare me, the game's intent is absolutely to be a horror game, which is what we're looking at here. So let's first examine the very, very few moments the game tries to elicit that sudden phasic fear response in us, and if they can be removed without fundamentally changing the game itself. Playing through this game again, there are really only 4 moments that I could charitably call scary. One of these moments is an encounter with Chad the clickbait chipmunk. Checking behind this alley here, we can find a random dead guy, and Lorraine's response to this is basically, shame that, which is a completely normal and human response to seeing a guy who was just murdered in a carnival alley. When you turn back around, the game remembers that Chad is on all of the promotional material and should probably include him in the actual game. So it slaps a static prop of him in front of your face before making it disappear because anything else might have been actually scary. The next 2 times are thankfully more interesting, but only in the sense that watching paint dry is slightly more interesting than watching paint that's finished drying. Both of these moments are essentially the same. The game roots you in place and forces you to look at one of the rides as it malfunctions and nearly hits you, or rather, veers to the side about 20 feet away from you and crashes nowhere near where you were standing, because why would a horror game want to make us feel like we're in danger when instead it could make us feel like we're standing approximately in the vicinity of where danger almost happened. The final moment is when you're on the Octotron and Spindly Johnny shows up. That's a callback. Just like Chad, he doesn't do anything other than stare at you and make the camera go blurry, but just like the prior 2 scares, you can't move or do anything, so again, it's basically just a cutscene. Oh, and there's also the cardboard monsters in the haunted house that pop up at you, but I don't think that should count. Regardless, since none of these moments have any narrative weight or relevance, they aren't gameplay obstacles, and they have no relevance to the story, removing all of these scare attempts wouldn't really change the game that much. So if the horror isn't coming from these attempts at phasic fear, where does it come from? Well, it isn't the fact that our son is lost in the creepy amusement park because I do not care about Callum, but I'd argue that's on purpose. Unlike in Fallout 4, where the writing was so bad that it wanted your main motivation to focus on a stupid potato baby you interacted with once, the park never wants you to care about Callum. Rather, it wants you to feel about Callum the same way Lorraine feels about Callum. Conflicted. So when you get to the climax of the game and Spindly Johnny forces Lorraine to place the ice pick over Callum's chest, the horror doesn't come from, oh no, Callum's in trouble. It comes from, is Lorraine finally going to give in to her intrusive thoughts and kill her son? Or at least that's where the horror would come from if Lorraine was a character I was invested in, because my reaction to the ending wasn't so much, Lorraine, no, don't give in, as it was, Lorraine, that's her name, kill your son and end this game! But the fact remains, the park would still be a horror game without those few extremely lazy, scary moments. It's primarily through its tone and atmosphere that it's aiming to build stress. As the game doesn't want you to stress about a monster, it wants you to stress about Lorraine's character as she spirals out of control. But now we have our smoking gun. The park isn't scary, but it is a horror game. So, Does that answer our question? Can horror games exist without scary elements? Well, I'm personally not quite satisfied. This is an example of a bad horror game that could still exist without those scares. So one could absolutely make the argument that a good horror game cannot exist without these phasic fear moments. So to prove that, we would need an example of a good horror game without those phasic fear elements. But alas, if only there were such a game I love to talk about that just so happened to have a mode that turned off the monsters. Just kidding, this is a video about SOMA now, bitches! SOMA, otherwise known as the game I always talk about next to A Hat in Time, never let it be said I don't have eclectic tastes, is a pretty damn well-regarded horror game, and for very good reason. I won't go into the plot that much here, one, because it's actually a very introspective and thought-provoking story that I can't really do justice in the confines of this video, and two, because it's slightly more complex than, good golly, I hate my son. If only there was a way I could be free of him.
Have you considered murder?
By God, you're right! But the basic gist is that you're Simon Jarrett, a man diagnosed with terminal Canadian, as well as a brain injury that will eventually kill him after an indeterminate amount of time. And thankfully, no, the writers did not engage in the incredibly lazy trope of you were actually hallucinating in a hospital this whole time. Our boy undergoes an experimental procedure, whereupon, bing bong, welcome to the future, everything sucks. Simon then embarks on a journey of self-discovery, spooky robots, and crushing existentialism, so basically near Automata without the ass. But more relevant to this video, it also has dangerous, insane robots who act as an active threat towards the player. The monsters in this game are all very well done, and for me, absolutely add to the experience. So let's take that away. What am I channeling there? Zigzag.
Shall we take his head away?
In 2017, frictional games added a safe mode where the player cannot die and the enemies are far less aggressive. For the purposes of this video, I swallowed my pride and went back to try the safe mode, and game's still spooky. In fact, the entire vibe of the game changes in a way that makes the horror take an entirely different tone. Since the base game presents you with the possibility of death and far more aggressive enemies, much of the focus is placed on your survival and avoiding the threat that is the monsters. Now, however, with that threat removed, the monsters change into walking horror stories. As I took my time to observe them, it was so much easier now to get drawn into the implications and tragedy of their twisted experience, all while the plot's main themes of what it means to be humans and the crushing despair we're being subjected to still rung just as true in the background. In other words, the game was still great. So, do we have our answer? Can we finally say that horror games don't need to be scary? Maybe. But, just to be sure, I want to hammer in one final nail in this spooky coffin. Horror doesn't have to be scary, and the best horror games can prove it. Now, Slanesh knows that I have a disturbing attraction to a well-done patrolling threat. Oh, please let it be something dangerous that wants to kill me. Yes! Oh, yes. Oh, it's like a doll thing. Oh, I'm so happy right now. So I'm not proposing something crazy like the only good horror games don't have any monsters in them. Rather, what I'm suggesting is a kind of litmus test when creating a horror experience. If you take a horror game, strip it of all its active threats and sudden scares, the result should still be a horror game. And not every game can do this. Unless you're someone who's afraid of becoming a furry, Security Breach would be a pretty dull experience if the animatronics weren't constantly hunting you down. Then we have Bendy and the Dark Revival, which would be a horror game for about 30 seconds before turning into a boring walk through a dirty basement if none of Joey Drew's murder victims were out to kill you. Even games I think are good, such as Secret of the Mimic, would be pretty dull without the omnipresent threat of Dark Johnny 5. Hey, I wonder if there's a trend in all these examples. But then we have horror games that really get it. Games that understand that horror doesn't come from the monster is part of the horror. I already talked about how SOMA is still creepy and oppressive without any real threats, so let's go for a lightning round! Silent Hill would still be a creepy town with haunting imagery and architecture set out to punish the main character. Dark Descent would still be a panicked attempt to fight against the creeping threat of the shadow while Daniel confronts its past. Still Wakes the Deep would still be a desperate, losing battle for survival against a decaying oil rig and the negligent actions of violent management. Fatal Frame would still be the chilling tale of loss, regret, redemption, all while exploring a cursed town that does not want you there or maybe wants you after all. Alien Isolation, if the alien never showed up, it would still be a chaotic scramble through a crumbling station full of desperate survivors and a massive corporation willing to sacrifice you all in the name of profit. Eve would still be the story of a little girl lost in a twisted world born of a tortured artist's desires and demons, along with allies she isn't sure sure she can trust. And this is what I mean by horror doesn't need to be scary. The best horror, or at least the horror I personally find the most effective, isn't derived from danger. Rather, to quote Big D,
It's the threat of torture that's the most important.
threat of the environment, the threats proposed by the story, the stress of the situation, the stress provided by the characters. These are all foundations of what horror needs. The scares, meanwhile, are the extra spice that works to punctuate those foundations. But I don't want it to sound like phasic fear is just some crutch used in bad horror games to cover up an otherwise poorly thought out experience. I mean, it's not like there's an entire genre of horror that's just been doing exactly that over and over. No one would ever shove marketable monsters in your face just to disguise how bland the experience actually is. I don't even... Okay, yes, that can and does happen. But to use a food metaphor because I'm hungry, making a fantastic horror experience is like creating a good chicken wing. While you absolutely can create a good wing without any sauce, it's the hot sauce that really gives it that kick to attract freaks like me who just have way too many hot sauces. I think this metaphor's getting away from me. But on the other hand, relying too much on the scary sauce can just make things overly messy. In that same way, a well-done threat or monster can add so much flavor, color, and texture in so many ways that you probably should just have a go at it. But again, not needed. The best horror doesn't base itself solely on the concept of, scary monster. There's always something else going on. Some underlying conflict, some personal connection, something disturbing, a base for the monster to build off of. Because while you can have a chicken wing without sauce, you can't just throw a glob of hot sauce on a plate and call it a meal. So, yes, even though I vastly prefer horror games with some real teeth to them, I can confidently say and even somewhat scientifically state, horror games don't need to be scary.